This week in the course, we study the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark is almost universally recognized to be the oldest of the Gospel accounts, and it's also the quirkiest. Mark has a kind of interesting history as an account, but it performs a really important function in the development of Christian literature as a whole. Prior to the writing of the Gospel of Mark, the word gospel, the Greek word euangelion, or good news, was primarily an oral message that was preached through the kerygma, the message, the teaching, the preaching of the church. So this was a word of mouth kind of thing while Christians were producing writing. The gospel wasn't understood to be like a written account. It was understood to be the good news about Jesus that they were sharing orally in their preaching and their teaching. As the Christian situation in the first century begins to evolve, you have a few things that happen. In the early 60s, you have some prominent Christian leaders that are executed under the first systematic Christian persecution by Emperor Nero. According to church tradition, we feel this is pretty reliable. Both Peter and Paul and several other important early believers, disciples, and evangelists lost their lives during this time. So bereft of their primary generation of early leaders, and also seeing the situation change in Palestine, we don't know exactly when Mark was written. Most folks think it's written prior to AD 70, but close to that time period when the Jewish revolt happens, and things are getting really kind of mixed up in that area. This marks a transition in Christian thinking. You know, it took several years for Christians to start writing their books down, and we talked about in the last lecture that this has to do in part because of the eschatological expectations of the first generation of believers. When they thought Jesus was coming back soon, they thought it was going to be like next Tuesday at 4 o'clock instead of soon in a relative sense in the day in the life of God. As their expectations begin to adjust, as their primary leaders begin to die, as the first generation of witnesses and people who are connected to Jesus begin to pass from natural or not so natural causes, in some cases, there becomes more of a need to preserve what it was that they taught, what it was they presented, what the oral tradition of the church was needed to be preserved. Mark is probably the first widely accepted written attempt to do that. Now, saying that, we also need to understand that even among early believers, this book has been kind of looked down on because if its language forms are kind of crude. If we were comparing Mark's Greek to the Greek we find in the Gospel of Luke or the book of Hebrews, Luke and Hebrews are writing on a post-collegiate level with very fine Greek syntax and construction. Mark writes more like what we might think of as a 7th or 8th grade level. He's a talented writer and a good storyteller. He's certainly a man of portraying things that are happening with a lot of action and rapidity, and portrays Jesus as a powerful man of action doing great deeds. But at the same time, Mark has a demonstratedly limited vocabulary. He'll use the same word, particularly euthus, which is a Greek word that conveys right then and immediately, then this happened. And he doesn't do transition very well. Everything's always happened right then, immediately. Some of the story elements in Mark might seem a little crude or embarrassing to more refined Christians. So Matthew and Luke, who almost certainly used Mark as a source for their writing, don't include them, or they change some of those details. In terms of the authorship of Mark, just like with all the other Gospels, we don't have a concrete nailed down, this is absolutely who wrote it, when and where and why. But from the early 2nd century, at least as far back as the early church leader Papias, who was active very early in the 2nd century, there was a widely held association that this was John Mark, who at one time had gone on a missionary journey with Paul as a very young man and kind of wimped out and went home, but got connected with and mentored by Peter. And this is from a very early period thought to be Mark's narration of Peter's account of the gospel. It enjoyed popularity in Rome and the regions around there from a very early period and was widely accepted, and it at least spread widely enough for Matthew and Luke to have the exact same structure of events, many of the same exact words that it uses. So it really provides the basis for what we call the synoptic tradition. The synoptic gospels, again, are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. These particular three share a similar sequence of events, a similar chronology for Jesus' life. A lot of the same major events take place, although they might be narrated a little bit differently. So Mark really provides an important basis. The other point is an ideological turning point that happens with Mark, that the good news about Jesus ceases to just be an oral proclamation, kerygma, but it becomes a written proclamation. It becomes scripture, and that becomes entrenched in the life of the church in a standardized form. Now, Mark, as a gospel, has the most occurrences of what we call a textual variant, and that's a slight difference between manuscript families of the Gospel of Mark coming from different parts of the world at different times. We'll look at that because it's particularly important at the end of the Gospel of Mark. Now, from all of the various New Testament manuscripts we had, and I shared with you last time that there's about 5,000 partial to complete manuscripts of the New Testament books that we include in our canon today, they're a very close match. There's about 46 verses out of the whole thing that are pretty hotly contested, and about half of those live at the end of the Gospel of Mark, where some manuscripts have them, some manuscripts don't. A reason a lot of scholars think that Mark is the oldest gospel other than Matthew and Luke's obvious reliance on it is that it is the crudest, it's the least refined, and typically when scholars are looking for good manuscripts to use or good base material, those are some of the criteria they're looking for. Is it rough around the edges? Does it show marks of a lot of editing? The early Christians let the book stand the way that it is instead of cleaning it up. It's surely a testament to their desire to present what the first Christians really taught, thought, and believed, even though later critics would kind of make fun of them for it. And Mark was one of the books that some of them kind of poked fun at because it is somewhat simplistic in its presentation and in its obviously limited vocabulary. But we're going to take a look at this gospel on its own merits and for some of the things that are unique and interesting within the gospel, and I think it'll be of benefit to you as we explore it together. One thing that's very characteristic of Mark's style is he does not beat around the bush. It just goes. He even begins his gospel saying, "In the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God." Boom, here it is. And he doesn't go back to Jesus having a birth story. There's no nativity or birth of Jesus story here. Jesus is just a grown-up man appearing on the scene, gets baptized by John, and launches straight into his ministry. And that happens in 9 verses, whereas the other books take several chapters to build up to that point. Mark has been arguably, and David Crutchley, who's our chair of the religion department, whom I happen to think is right about this, very much so, Mark is patterned not so much after a complete account style, but is more like a Greco-Roman biography, which is not really concerned with what people like to eat for breakfast when they were a child or their upbringing, but what they did in their adult life that is of significance. And Mark definitely portrays the story that way. A key idea in Mark is that Jesus is authenticating his message through dunamis, through a work of power. And that's what role the miracles, and there are a lot of them in Mark, play. Jesus is demonstrating works of power to authenticate his message and his identity. Look for opportunities in Mark for Jesus to be misunderstood by basically everybody. Jesus also gets a little frustrated in Mark. He's a little angrier at some points in Mark than he is in some of the other Gospels. And I think we'll enjoy that as we move through it together. Another thing in Mark is that is a key is Mark really presents Jesus as an electrifyingly powerful exorcist, somebody who can cast out a demonic spirit who is inhabiting or oppressing a human being. And that's a big idea with Mark, that Jesus has power over the demonic. And we'll certainly look at that and we'll talk about what that means. It's unfortunate we can't do that in a face-to-face setting, but we'll take a look at that as we move through the text.